passive and timid. So you've just basically been like exploiting their personality in order to benefit you in combat. And like, wait a minute, I'm going to have to find another healer. Or, like, I mean, ideally apologize or like, send some heals back. Hey, I'm Demon Dev, and I've been doing a lot of progress and work. And I've been telling people, if you've been in Discord and Art Dev Soup is where I'm at mainly. I've been in Abstractlandia for quite some time. I think the plan was to kind of wrap up a quick UI, kind of moving things around in like a couple weeks, and we are now 4 months later. And in some ways that's been a bit sad, but in some ways it's really overall just really exciting for me, because I had one of the biggest realizations and kind of breakthroughs on working on the game, which is that I can fix my two biggest problems, the pacing and the like ease, as far as like from the player's point of view, figuring stuff out. And so what I was doing over in this part of the scene, deep on the other side of the scene, I just need to go back and clean this up. It's like, okay, so how am I going to make actions work? I don't even have the player character, so I was just using two different characters that I do have mostly done, Poppy and Eve, to figure out actions. And the idea here was, in VR, it's really satisfying to do things like punching, or potentially things like kissing, and many other romance actions, or stealing, crouching. But in practice, there's two big problems. One, the physicality aspect. Yeah, it's a lot of work, and that can be really bracing. But the faster you do things, the less like understanding you can have of what's actually happening as far as what the game recognizes. Like, you can think of yourself like punching, and that you punched, but like, does the game know that? Where are the hitboxes? Like in VR, you're looking through a straw practically. When it comes to hand-to-hand combat, like, you might see your hand like 5% of the time, when it's in front of you first person. I mean, we've all seen first person shooter games with like, you got the reload animation, and it's like, oh yeah, I have hands, because you never see them otherwise. So like, what about actions where your face isn't even looking at the thing you're doing? Like, one thing that I'm really excited about, and have been for a long time, is to focus on the extremely more like subtle, nuanced physical actions, whether it's in romance or combat or magic, because those are often way more emotionally charged. Like, if you're like in a all-out fight with someone, like, those are, it's still important, but like, every single punch doesn't matter. In fact, you could count on, with like a boss fight, that you're going to be wailing on each other for quite a while. So on the flip side of that, like in an action movie, maybe like the hero is like greatly injured or something like that, sometimes at like certain emotional beats, you're getting very heavily invested moments where this one punch or like dodge like is the win or the loss effectively. So same thing with as I talked a little bit in my one of my previous videos, I want to figure out how to make something that is real, which is like, oh, what if I tried to start holding hands with this girl that I've been flirting with, and I think she's been flirting with me, or a guy, or anyone. And what if I start scooting my hand towards her? Couldn't that be a really fun strategic mechanic within a game? And I think that's basically never been attempted for a lot of reasons, other than like having something simple like maybe press A to kind of have that action carried out. But especially within VR, because like, hey, your head's not going to be looking at your hand. That would take all the subtlety out of it. I mean, you can imagine in real life, if you're like staring at her hand like this, there's no more like, I guess, anticipation and, like the decision caught in panic and anxiety on like whether you're going to try to do it or not. And if she moves her hands away, or like she just kind of automatically scoots away, because, one interpretation is just like it's an accidental touch and not intended as like a romantic gesture. So all those things could happen, and if you stare at it, it takes all of the subtlety and drama out of it. Anyways, as you can see up on screen, and as I was starting to talk about in the past, as well as I've got it up here, so I'll show you how that's working really soon, probably in the next video. what if you visualize the hand or the head, both for punches, kisses, like handholds, hugs, same thing. If you could give a profile view, okay, yes, you have terrible field of view, even in VR, even as field of view is getting better, you have terrible field of view relative to your hands. Like, where are your hands? A lot of the times you can't see them unless you're working with something right here, which is often not a part of, winding up the punch. And then after you fully completed the punch. And again, this is happening so fast, even with high frame rate, you're going to be punching as fast as you can. So you really can't keep an oversight on um, what the location of your hand is relative to triggering like damage, or do you need to follow through. um, Something that I was kind of reminded to definitely not do is try to get the player to respect nebulous space that the game wants them to. So like, if you were to punch and it got blocked, I'm never going to make it so that you have to like match your hand to like where it got blocked to in order to resume. Like, I'm going to do everything in my power to never dislocate the virtual hand from the real one. And there's a lot of different ways you can do that, mostly by moving all the characters and environment, or just shoving the VR space to keep them aligned, are all options. But yeah, what are we going to do there? So if you take a profile view from the side, then you suddenly, you get that third person perspective. Then you suddenly can see everything extremely clearly. You can judge the distance between things. And it's just kind of a fun feedback that you can have over here. Where is it? Oh, yeah. It's just a fun feedback you can have over here, where basically you're wondering, okay, at what distance am I beginning to trigger her being like aware of what I'm trying to do? And that's going to be this kind of yellow distance. In fact, if you hang out in that yellow distance, it will trigger an anticipation reaction. So you haven't even completed the action, but they're going to start figuring out what they want to do about it, if anything. Just let it happen. So yeah, that's what that's what you get to have as like a side view, is like a little panel that shows you what's going on from the side. Anyways, halfway through doing all of that, I started to realize, oh man, there's no way this is going to be manageable at the same time as like a conversation or other things, and which is something that's always been really important to me with this project. I wanted to figure out a way so you could like talk to people during battle, both allies and enemies. One, just because I love story elements, and in some ways, it's kind of sad to me that if you have a very story heavy game, a lot of that just sort of needs to pause or be automatic without any sort of like checks for what the player's thinking. So like, in order to be able to execute combat mechanics like attacks and dodges, do you really have the space, multitask wise, and or just the kind of screen UI space, or the pacing to allow you to make decisions like socially with what you're going to say to people or to your enemies and allies separately. So it became obvious that as I was working on this rework, it wasn't going to do the trick, and I needed to change some things up. And I had one of the biggest breakthroughs that I've had, which is the combination reaction system. So what if, instead of the AI visualizing a reaction to every single thing that happens, what if I take the thing that they're reacting to, which is like what the player's doing? Did you say something in a passionately way, or boisterous, or lots of other different ways you can say things? There's like, I think 170 damage types for emotions. Depending on that, the AI can then calculate not just what they're going to do next, but everything that is inspired by that response. So they'll have a reaction, and then they might simultaneously move to, if you're in combat, deflect, or do a counterattack, and then simultaneously in dialogue, maybe if they're anticipating not being threatened by what you're doing, then they'll make some sort of dismissive comment like, is that the best you've got? Something like that. So then basically, as soon as I had this idea, I was like, okay, could this work? And it just started solving all of the biggest problems. One is the pacing. It's been really important to me to make it so that I actually visualize what the AI is thinking. I've been annoyed by dialogue choices. It feels like my whole life where I do want to deeply connect with being the player, or just like seeing what this character is capable of in this world, in the story. But the choices don't matter, and then I kind of feel like almost like insulted or something, or condescended to, when the game's like, here's a choice, and like I can either feel like it's not a good choice, or I'm not invested in any of those choices, especially when it's a really important moment that I feel like would allow me to like see, not just like, oh, I wonder what happens in the game, but I want to see a very specific, what will happen in the game relative to what I'm interested in. I'm definitely in full on tangent mode, but basically in so many books, movies, stories, like anime, there's such a fascinating concept going on in the world, and like maybe even the character's primary motivation. And I feel like it gets lost. And that is probably even more punishing than when the focus is held. So like maybe like what, will these two characters get together? They have so much conflict. They're being pulled in different directions by other partners, or maybe by some sort of political conflict in their different factions. Stuff like that is so fascinating. And then like if the show or the story takes a pivot and just determines that it's pure power fantasy, kind of thing, and that's just kind of ignored and not even remotely resolved, I am so frustrated by that. And I get that it's really difficult for a story to anticipate what people find most interesting about something. I'm not pretending that that's easy, but that's what's so important to me about this project, about Double Demons, is I want to take all potential, you know, big arcs, whether it's romance arc, combat, political, who's going to be your enemies, who's going to be your allies, and how big of a like power player and in what way. I want to take all those arcs seriously. So even if I'm limited in content and have to kind of solve some of those branches later, I'm okay with that as long as I can kind of relay in choices or in constraint constrained choices, what the player can and can't do. And now I think I have the tool to do that. So with combination reactions, you've always been able to kind of say things, multiple things in a row, but now the exact same emotional damage type can now be applied to actions and anything else you do. So AIs are not just all psychopathically aware of everything the player is doing, but actually I manage it in what I call self-consciousness state. So you're going to be able to see the emotional properties of all the things you do. And basically what that means is that when you even just like pick up objects, like the type of objects that you're picking up or what you're doing with them, or drink coffee, or going to school, those sorts of things will just kind of put like stick emotions on you that will have a small influence. If the person you're like talking to or interacting with, if they're reacting to something you're doing, it'll have a small effect on that, and you can kind of manage what will be kind of your modifiers as you're going into that. But as you can probably guess from what I've been kind of going on and on about, this inspiration came deep into the process of building the system. So I had a lot of rework to do. I made chain reactions work for the first time, and pretty much as soon as it was all working, I realized that, okay, sure, it works if you wrap up each piece of content as you do it. Maybe I set up a toggle so you could go back and forth between a conversation and some sort of an activity like combat. That was fine and working. But the problem is, if I assume you have to kind of pursue a conversation or a combat scene to its conclusion, yeah, I wasn't ever very happy about the constraints of that on the player. But it also put a lot of pressure on the writing to achieve a certain pacing. It also put a lot of pressure on the actions to, well, feel compelling to the player. I think all games probably struggle with the motivating the player to do all the things that's required. But I then had an additional inspiration that I really fell in love with for like what it could mean for this game, which is making it all optional. and not in like an MMO quest style where you just kind of batch sign up for every possible thing and then do whatever works in some sort of like optimized run, which is cool. But I want it to be more story, emotional, and like your relationship with these other characters involved. So essentially, when you talk to people, if you say you're going to do something, you don't actually have to do that thing, but that character will think about that. So it'll just apply a relatively simple expectation buff. So initially, anytime you say you're going to do stuff, assuming that they want you to, or like they asked you to, or something, um, that will actually have a slight positive influence on how they react to you in general. But if you then don't do the thing, especially for like a period of time, then it will generate frustration for them. Additionally, if you do nice things for people and they can't figure out a way to like decline, it can actually result in them accumulating guilt. So like kind of being uncomfortable in a different way where maybe, doing things like, getting someone coffee or something on the way to school, or uh, giving someone a ride. I'm not exactly sure what all the opportunities for generosity towards other characters will be. But when you do something like that, maybe if, especially if the relationship isn't very deep, or they feel like it's always like they're getting stuff from you, then you will have to it's kind of like the reverse of expectations. Their expectations are they don't want you to do stuff. So I've found that the frustration and guilt system gives me the perfect kind of flexible, sort of like a band-aid, but more like, a push-pull mechanic that allows the player to chaotically do stuff, not do stuff, sort of do stuff. You're doing half the assignment, and then you can have a beautiful conflict where the fact that you've left a lot of side projects and, I guess in a game's point of view, a bunch of side quests like half completed. That's I think the perfect relationship moment for characters to, okay, it's been 3 days. It's not that hard of a calculation for the AI to go through. 3 days. They told me they were going to do a thing. And not just that, but like they're in a mad mood and maybe like frustrated with you for some other reason. So I can take that piece of content, which is that side quest, and have them basically try to force a conversation with you about it and be like, like, how come you never do anything? And I feel like the conflicts that come out of those conflicts, the conflicts that comes out of those conflicts, the conversations that you could have with people, which is very much real life. It's not like the direct philosophical conversations I always thought were very meaningful, but it feels very removed from real life in a condescending and an annoying way, where basically if you try to write conversations, as I have for this game many times, with how deep the choices are, I feel an intense motivation to, stir up some conflict. Like, how can these characters be at each other's throats? But like an overly simplistic thing that I was attached to in the past, or just thought like, how else am I gonna put characters in conflict, is like, oh, they're just like on different sides. Like this character, wants to, keep the player out of the spirit world, out of their farm, and this character wants them to have them farm. So it's like, relatively simple. But what I was realizing about this more mess of being able to allow AIs to become frustrated in like a temporary buff or debuff kind of a way, where effectively most characters will find some outlet. It allows me to craft an extremely specific premise for like a writing prompt. Like, writing dynamic story in games is really challenging. Blank canvas is bad enough when you have all the details of what you want to happen, but like, let alone when you're trying to cast into the void of stuff you have no idea what could be happening. But hey, now I have some variables that I can generate a writing prompt for myself. Okay, write this scene if, like this character that you're running, the occult club where you research new spells, is, say she's really frustrated you because you've been skipping a lot of meetings, or like saying you're going to like try to get some spell books from someplace and then like never showing up. Like, oh, that could just be represented as like frustration and and maybe like a decelerate, like a great acceleration in frustration. Like recently, whatever you've been doing, it's pissing her off. Write a prompt for that. And the perfect kind of backdrop for that could be like, like how come you don't give a fuck about the club? You never show up. I thought this was important to you. Like that kind of a conflict where it's not just like a surface level, like, what do you believe? Should the queen uh be allowed to remain in control, or should the sub factions, be able to rise up? Like, what's the right amount of territory? It's like, it's so like, okay, maybe that exists in real life, but it's not that personal. And on a personal level, like talking about it with someone, like, what is that going to change? But essentially being challenged because there's a lot of pressure on your time in this game to be like, oh, am I going to tell this person, like, I mean, maybe legitimately the player doesn't need to prioritize the club, or maybe they know that um, this character is going to keep working on the spells and stuff, even when they aren't, even when they are kind of neglecting it themselves. Those kinds of choices are just so fascinating to me, because then you can have what feels like a real conflict about it from player to character. So these sorts of variables, bring them in, and now with the combination reactions, you can have all this going on, and the pace of it can be great. Like, you can come into a club and they're like, oh, now you're here, as far as like the occult club goes, like maybe even post fight, and you're just trying to act normal, and maybe they're still like in a bad mood or pouting about it, and you can choose to try to let it blow over. Maybe one of the best ways to resolve someone being really frustrated is like it eventually comes out in some way. I mean, ideally there would be like an apology mechanic, and I've done some explorations for how that could work in a more dynamic way. Like maybe your phone allows you to access more like free hanging node content, which would be like apologizing, asking a girl out, or like, asking them for a favor could be something that's, accessible almost anytime. Like you could attempt it at least. So maybe that was one way that could work. But another way that a character can essentially offload their frustration at the player would be to blow up at them and like try to like accuse them or be mean to them in some sort of a way. And maybe after they do that, maybe not immediately, but maybe the buff kind of wears off and it resets it to zero. It may even be really fun if the if the AI character feels like the way the way that their frustration manifested, like they just like screamed at you and like ate you out for like, just being a jerk or something. If they do that, you can see a dramatic flip flop of their their maxed out frustration bar being converted into some sort of guilt, which again also happens in real life, and also would be such a beautiful prompt to write towards, to be able to have such a dramatic emotional shift. It's not just like a conversation that happens in a game, but a legitimate mechanical transformation that you're seeing. Like maybe them being extremely frustrated with you has suddenly become an issue because they're ruining other friendships that you're trying to get into, because they're like, I don't know, putting you down in group scenarios, or at one point you're going to homecoming. So maybe even if you get them to agree to go with you to homecoming, if you start ditching out on school or like the cult club, if you start like not showing up and doing all the stuff that, that she's excited about, and you've kind of taken the wind out of her sails on that, then maybe when you go to homecoming, even with this person, they're like kind of out to get you, and putting you down at every turn, and steering the conversation and your relationships in ways that you don't want. Um, of course, some of your friends will feel bad for you, but that may not be an outcome that's advantageous mechanically in the game. So I'm just really excited about those interactions. And I think it's kind of like having a theme at a game jam, having specific constraints and specific scenarios to write for, and be able to relatively easily generate a prompt that I can then fill out on the writing end, and then eventually maybe hire more writers and look towards that end to be like, hey, here's an extremely fun scenario that can happen where you start dating this person, and then maybe he is going to, do some stuff that you don't like, and then you break up with him, and all the sorts of things that can come out of that. it could lead to like, crazy events that I never envisioned, but because they can be represented in really simple variables, relatively simple variables like friendship, respect, and then frustration and guilt. Once I have a combination of all of those things, great, I can generate a prompt, write to it, and then see how it feels in that exact scenario. And probably because it's mechanically, based, because it's directly related to all of the player's actions, and then being able to see those actions, it should feel really good. It should be really fun. So I'm excited about that. And I'm excited to wrap up this new system, which in order to allow that, you need to allow the player to frustrate AIs or make them feel guilty. Do things that they do want or don't do things that they do want, and vice versa with stuff they don't want. Maybe something cool that could happen is you could intentionally or just allow guilt to accumulate in a character, and then they'll just start doing nice things to kind of get the guilt to go away. So perhaps if you do a lot of nice things for a character, depending on their personality, one of the ways that they handle guilt is to bring you coffee, which will boost your energy for the day. And it could be part of a big mechanic for how that should work. Although I think it would also be just as fascinating to have certain personalities where if their guilt is high for a long time, they take it out on you, which, doesn't make the guilt go away. So they'll just continuously like snipe at you or do some sort of weird psychological interaction with you, like trying to assign negative intentions. This is a really common thing. If you feel really guilty, then for some people's personalities, it becomes really appealing to try to reframe the nice thing someone has done for you in a negative light. So for example, say you're like teaching someone and you're teaching someone over and over for a really long time. Sometimes, I mean, of course, and maybe this person is still very grateful towards you, but perhaps it sours for them in some way, which is really sad, but does happen. And they begin to feel like, like, man, like this person is so special. They taught me, like that's really nice. And like, what are they getting out of it? And maybe they start to feel bad. It's a really common artist experience where as soon as you get help from someone, you like have this need to reciprocate and pay it forward, and you don't always have an opportunity to do that. In fact, sometimes when someone's really nice to you and like teaches you a thing like how to draw something or like how to do something in code, let's focus on artists. If they teach you how to do something, you might offer like, oh, I can help you with this thing. And maybe that doesn't align. It could be some teachers don't like being taught. I think most do, but for whatever reason, it doesn't work with like what they want for themselves. And that could be really frustrating because you want to take this powerful, positive experience of them helping you and like, equalize it. You want to give back. And then sometimes people have an experience where anytime someone does them a favor, it's held over them as leverage, which is, of course, a very dysfunctional thing to do without it being, more direct and communicated. Sometimes if someone gets you a coffee, they like, it kind of goes deep into their subconscious. They're like, man, they owe me. I'm always nice to them. They never do anything for me. So a really cool thing that could happen in the game is, yeah, if guilt is completely maxed out for one character, maybe they start to to see ghosts. They're like they're imagining like bad intentions that you may have or don't have, but it's also possible the player does have. Sometimes being suspicious of people does, even without like due cause, can bring something to the surface that's like fascinating and kind of a revelation. So yeah, what if the player does something nice consistently? AI is guilty. The AI is like, oh, can I get you this? And the player is like, no. Can I do this for you? No. And so they kind of burn out on steam for what they can do. And then they start to be like, man, like maybe they only taught me so they could feel good about themselves, or like maybe it's because they're like, they judge me and they think I need it. I don't need their help. And it, can create all sorts of like, again, very real to real life conflicts. And I think I now have the framework for that to work. When I start writing, I can be generating these conflicts, and it should be a wild experience because like of course this exists, but in a game you would never expect that to be possible because usually like you do a thing that the character likes or you do a thing the character doesn't like. The idea that you could have an experience where you do something the character likes but they start to not like the fact that they liked it and that you did it and they have no way to like give back and now they're suspicious of you and you're just like whoa. A lot of games are essentially about control, and I don't think there's anything wrong with a game where the player seeks to expand their level of control because that's the mechanics, even if in real life it would be quite a problem. Exploring that is so cool, and seeing like in a sense, players take a step back, like, oh wow, maybe like all those times that I saw like the guilt bar go up, and I'm like, hey, that just gives me a slight buff to how they treat me, so like no problem. Maybe in the future they're like, oh, maybe that was a mistake. Maybe I should try to find some sort of way to depressurize that guilt by like reassuring them or allowing them to do something nice for me that I'm like more like middle of the road about, like those sorts of like reactionary strategies, emergent player behavior that can come out, and I'm sure there will be much more creative things that come out that are cooler than that. But that's what I can think of when I think about how these things are going to work. So it's been really tough, and definitely like 4 months to kind of recalculate the interface was a lot harder or more time than I was expecting to figure this stuff out. But I hope that was interesting. That was just kind of like a brain dump of like, oh man, like I'm so excited. Like, why am I spending so long on figuring out the system? Like, I didn't even go into what I'm now calling the super micro, which is the ability to take the 36 option grid, and this is maximum. It won't ever be that many choices, but sometimes you'll have 6 different meaning decisions. Sometimes you'll have like 1 or 2 meaning decisions with 6 emotional variants. That's what the grid kind of represents. So the super micros ends up being like, oh, it'd be nice if you could just, realign these if you wanted to simplify all the information into just the emotional categories without focusing on the meaning. And you basically just stack these all below each other. That would be pretty crazy to, in a chaotic, non-rational way, just scrub through every possible emotional category. So there's all sorts of stuff going on in order to make that flow faster. You can perceive your dialogue options before it's even your turn to talk, and that goes for actions as well as dialogue. So they're talking and you're thinking like, okay, the next thing I'm going to say is going to be like hostile or frustrated. And then the fact that you can kind of repurpose that dead time as you're waiting for them to like fully type out what they're going to say. Maybe you're doing actions at the same time. If you're in combat and you ask somebody to heal you, which I think should work through the system, it'll be a social thing, not just like a mechanical, like you make your ally heal you, but you say like, heals, I need healing. That's not an automatic thing. The healer on your team will react to that in their own like processing. And while they're figuring out what to say, if you're not getting immediately healed, then you can like kind of pre-scrub through, like basically ignoring whatever they're going to say to like emphasize that, you want that now. Kind of almost regardless of the, minor relationship implications, because, it's alive. So it's not like you go into combat and people's feelings turn off. You might treat people in your team relatively poorly in the context of battle. And I think that characters should be written to have more flexibility, but it might still piss them off. It might still like fundamentally change your dynamic if you're just yelling at your team to get stuff done faster. If you lean into that for I assume the mechanical advantage of, basically your team starting to put your interests first, so that if you're the primary damage dealer, or or at least you feel like that, and you feel like you're able to convince them and persuade them, then that could be like a fascinating thing that happens dynamic wise. Is you could see your friendship, which is exactly how mean and friendly works. So if you're like you're shouting at your teammates to heal you and like not do whatever they were doing, that eventually will escalate to being like mean emotions over and over. Mean universally will bring down your friendship. So like kind of the overall like liking you on that end, but will create more opportunities to gain their respect. So if you do all that and then you pull off some incredible moves, then their respect for you will grow even faster than if you were nice and pulled off crazy moves. It kind of like, it's in a gambling way, it like really raises the stakes, but your friendship doesn't like recover automatically. So you could very easily go into a play style where you're being mean to literally everyone in order to maximize your power in battle, and they might still do it. I mean, it's still a relationship reaction every time, and all AI's reaction time is bumped up significantly in the heat of battle. So they're going to be making quick decisions. Like if for some reason you decided you wanted to pay social attention to how a character is reacting to you, like demanding they like run away or heal you or something, then you would see that that's like the blip on the bar would like, just kind of scoot left or right. And then boom, they would do what they're going to do. Or maybe one of their decisions is just to like crumble into a ball and be like, everyone's being too mean to me. I can't fight. I'm done for the day. And they kind of like despawn themselves home. And you're like, those kinds of things are now going to be, well, I should say attemptable. I've set up the structure so that you can multitask. You can manage all that going on. You can make split-second decisions where you don't know exactly what you're going to say, but you can scrub through just the emotional categories, and the general context is like, oh, I was asking them to heal me, and they're saying something like I wasn't really listening. But if I say something in response to that is like demanding, then I know that like I'm asking them to give me my way on this, basically, or I can assume that, and then I can check back later to see like what I actually said. But that kind of taking it from a rational level, which is what I've always kind of put on a pedestal with this dialogue system, and being like, okay, you can actually step back and look at it at a purely emotional level. Like I'm just kind of use my intuition to select something and fire it off. Now you can select emotionally, then expand the full interface, even while doing other stuff. You can expand the full interface and then like kind of check the words of it real quick. But like that is going to be, take a lot more focus than just scrubbing through the emotions. So I think a lot of times once you start to build skills and sort of trust in what you can expect, then you should be able to like pull those options out on the fly. And you're, like you're killing bosses, you're, fighting enemies, and you're potentially either improving or maybe damaging your relationships with your allies. I think that would be so insane. And I see it working. Again, I'm in a test scene, so like I've got an image in the background so I can focus on just the elements and a couple test examples, but I can see it working in the system because I've lowered the barrier to how long it takes to make options, and I've increased the ability of the player to ignore a bunch of stuff, like just don't do stuff. Like what if, I don't know if I want to go in this direction, but maybe what if your allies are like trying to talk to you in battle, you, the player, and they're asking you to heal them, and you ignore it. Like, okay, tiny bit of frustration built. You ignore them. You never send the heals back. you only get the heals. And then suddenly their frustration is really high. Like, damn, they're not sending heals your way. Maybe their personality is even that they're very like, passive and timid. So you've just basically been like exploiting their personality in order to benefit you in combat. And like, wait a minute, like I'm gonna have to find another healer, or like, I mean, ideally in real life, if that was your life, you would like apologize or like send some heals back. Maybe in a somewhat like like this is irritating to me. You like maybe you have magic cash to buy some potions on the black market or something like that, and then you hope that makes their frustration with you go away. It would be really cool. This is my double-edged sword. I'm really inspired by mechanics that could live within these sorts of interactions. Like, what if, you do that? You've been getting a healer to heal you. You've just been kind of escalating emotionally every single time in the heat of battle. They're extremely frustrated. Your friendship is like in the shitter. And maybe they respect you, which is why they still do it. Like assuming if you spam someone to heal you and you're like the worst person on your team, probably they will just stop healing you because they don't have that respect for you. But assuming you've been able to maintain those top performance capabilities, which is like the only reason your team tolerates you. Um, yeah, what if you're like, man, like what she want, like she or he, maybe let's make it a male healer. If he wants to go like on some sort of like side quest to like get special items for like a better staff, and you're like, check out like the way that that's gonna go, and maybe you even agree to it, so you set the expectation and now it's been 2 days and they're like, oh, so we're gonna go today, and you're like, so like the best you could come up with is like, okay, these are dynamic elements, so it wouldn't be integrated into the same conversation, but maybe you're like, okay, I'm gonna cancel on the person, which is going to make them feel extreme frustration. But then I'm going to like get them a gift of like, you know, some potions or some like other like worse staff or something like that. And you do all those like, you like kind of prep it in your hand like afterwards, like, oh, but I like got you this thing instead. Hopefully, like you understand I'm a busy hero. I got stuff to do. Please still heal me in the upcoming tournaments. Thank you. It would be really cool for like there's to be some effect where basically that like kind of stabilizes things. Like it doesn't make their frustration go. In the past, I've experimented with mechanical variables like graying out the what's it called? Graying out a relationship variable. So basically saying like this is still here, but it's not actively affecting their reaction. So the way that frustration and guilt works currently, which I guess I haven't really explained, is that normally there's a reaction that goes from like 0 to 10. And your base relationship for friendship might be like 5. So every time you say something that's kind of slice of life, like, oh, how are you today? So it starts at 5. You maybe used a polite tone, and maybe this character appreciates politeness because they're more timid and they need encouragement to be themselves. So it goes up a little bit. So it's like 7 out of 10, and they're kind of like nice to you. The way that frustration works is it's a negative clamp. So maybe normally their reaction would be 7 out of 10, which would make them select something like, oh, good, how are you? I've missed you. If it's a 7 out of 10 a natural 7 out of 10, a frustration of like 5 would clamp it to be a 5 out of a 10. So it's like kind of reduce them back to their neutral, a neutral reaction. Like, oh, fine, like maybe less engaging. So the idea that you could take that and then maybe gray it out, which essentially would, I think, tell the player, and I would explain this, that like, okay, they're ignoring their extreme frustration with you right now. So like you canceled on the big side quest to help them get a better weapon, and they're like maybe maxed out like 10 out of 10 frustration. So like if they are actively using their frustration, which they initially would be, they're going to do a 0 out of a 10. Every single thing you do in the friendship realm is going to be calculated at a 0 out of 10. So they're going to find everything that they can to basically be like, I'm not doing that. I don't want to do that. So maybe by giving them the gift, and maybe gifts work this way in general, it's a band-aid. It's not actually solving core character problems. Maybe that is the new spammable gift mechanic, is I allow the player to give gifts as long as the context is appropriate. You can freeze their frustration. So you can gray out as much frustration as they have. So maybe they have 10 out of 10 frustration. You're like, hey, here's like a grab bag. Here's a goodie bag of all the stuff that is my apology cookie. Here you go. And like it like takes some time for them to process essentially. So then like maybe for 2 days, they will not weigh in their 10 out of 10 frustration towards you. Something like that. Maybe I would have some sort of sub clamp where you couldn't have a more positive reaction from them than an 8 out of 10. I'm not sure. But it would be so cool to have, grayed out frustration. So then like a trigger event, if you do something that like kind of revitalizes their frustration, that it comes on full force. And then they go from, being polite and civil and being like, yeah, like, okay, let's go get this battle over. And then you like kind of say the wrong thing to them because they're already like got maxed out 10 out of 10 frustration. They just lose it. And I don't know if I'll have like friendly fire be a serious risk. I think that might be putting too much strain on the player, even if they're aware that their team hates them. But maybe they would just like, yeah, like, drop out of the game and or out of the spirit world and like kind of leave you on your own or something, I think would be cool. So we'll see how that actually goes. But again, I can see things like that mechanically working within this new interface and the new system for the writing tool that I'm doing for Double Demons and Electra. So as you can see, I'm very excited. And this is what is getting me through working on this kind of rework